you can set the atmosphere. We may come in and we may have some things that are hanging on us that we've had to deal with throughout the week. We may have some struggles that we've been going through. But if you'll make the effort to set the atmosphere, if you'll make the effort to come in and recognize that no matter what we may have been going through, no matter what issues, no matter what struggles, no matter what attack we may have been in the midst of, that we're here to praise Yahweh, that will make the difference. Amen? You realize that that's why the Sabbath is so important. Throughout the week, we can sometimes get our eyes off of Him. The little problems and the issues that we may be going through, they become a mountain, don't they? And they become what completely blocks out anything else. We can't see anything but the problem. That's all we see. And it seems like we're never going to be able to get past it. We're not going to be able to go around it. It's too big to go over it. And it just seems as if we're stuck. And we're dealing with this issue, and there's no way that we can see a way out. But do you realize that on the Sabbath, what happens is Yahweh reminds you where your eyes need to be? And so now all of a sudden, this thing that became a mountain in the middle of the week, now when you come to the Sabbath and you begin to praise Him and you begin to feel His presence and you hear His words and He begins to woo you and draw you, all of a sudden your eyesight begins to look at Him. Our eyes are stayed upon Him. And now we find that this mountain, this huge obstacle that's been in our life, it doesn't look so big anymore, does it? It's beginning to put in perspective that if Yahweh be for us, then who can be against us? And we're reminded that our God, our Elohim, is much more than able. Can you say amen? How many of you really believe that? Amen. Well, good. Because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. We're going to take a look at this week's Torah portion. It's titled Yitro. Can you say that with me? Yitro. It's the name in Hebrew of Jethro, Moshe's father-in-law. And it covers Exodus chapter 18, verse 1 through chapter 20, verse 23. And if you've read it, then you know it's covering a very important section of the scriptures, isn't it? It's covering the 10 Commandments, the giving of the law, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. It's one of the most fundamental aspects of our faith. It's also one of the most confrontational, isn't it? No matter what denomination you may be, no matter whether you consider yourself just a Christian believer or Hebrew roots, this can be a controversial subject. If we're dealing with people that are outside of the Hebrew roots movement that don't look at this as covenant, then it's controversial because that's law, it's bondage, it's been done away with. But then when we even move inside into the house where we understand this as covenant, it's still controversial, isn't it? Because how do we keep it? We become Torah police. It still causes strife and division, we find. And so when we begin to look at this subject, we have to understand, what is this about? This Torah, this giving of the commandments, the words of Yahweh that was given to us. What have we done with it, and what was its purpose? We find that when we look at this Torah portion and we begin to look at the way Yahweh presents it to the children of Israel, we understand it's a wedding contract, isn't it? It was literally their ketubah, their wedding document that He's presenting to the individuals that He had chosen to be His bride. He's brought them out of Egypt, out of bondage, and He's brought them to the base of the mountain to speak His word into their lives. He's brought them there to love on them, to pour His love upon them. And we find that their response is, all that you have said, we will do. Isn't it easy to make that response when you're at the base of the mountain? It's easy to make those type of declarations, but it's when we leave the mountain that is really when the rubber meets the road, isn't it? And we find how serious did we take that commitment? How much are we really willing to keep what we said we were going to keep? And as I was looking at this, I thought, well, isn't this interesting? Because we often look at this passage of Scripture as the giving of the Torah, the giving of the commandments. And yet if you'll backtrack, you'll find that Israel was very familiar with the Torah, the teachings, the commandments of Yahweh. This is not the first time they've been introduced to it. In fact, directly before the Sinai encounter, when the judges are being set into place and the judicial system's being set up at the beginning of the portion, it specifically says that they're making judgments. They're dealing with issues, and it's based upon the Torah. When we backtrack, we find that Abraham was an individual that was acknowledged as one that would keep the Torah, that kept the commandments. In fact, I believe that if you begin to look in the Hebrew, you'll find that Adam knew the Torah. He knew the commandments, and he kept this covenant with Yahweh, passed down throughout the generations to Shem, to Noah, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Israel was familiar with the fact that they were in covenant with Yahweh. They may have gotten away from it, but they knew that they were in covenant with him. So we have to ask the question that if they were familiar with this, if the Torah has been being passed down and they were already judging based upon these commandments, what was the Sinai experience about? What was the purpose of them being brought to the mountain and Yahweh speaking to them, declaring orally the 10 words, the 10 commandments, this contract? What was the purpose? Now, this is important because you and I as well are going to face the same encounter in the days ahead. He's going to bring you back to his mountain. Once again, you're going to stand at the base and you're going to be hearing these same words and you're going to have to answer as well. What are you going to do with it? But we need to understand, what's the purpose of this? What was the point of bringing them to Sinai and going through this covenant ceremony? Well, if we backtrack, we find that the name of this Torah portion is taken from Moshe's father-in-law. And this is when it starts, when Yitro arrives into the camp. And if you read it, it may seem as something that's really, it's insignificant because the Sinai experience is just the next chapter. And so immediately we rush to Sinai. We rush to the giving of the commandments, the giving of the Torah, but yet it's starting with Yitro, and it's named after Yitro. And we understand that nothing's for filler material. And in fact, this is one of the few Torah portions that's named after an individual. So immediately there's a flag that begins to wave. There's something important about this term, Yitro. You realize that names are prophetic. There's a prophetical declaration that's encased in this name. And it seems as if maybe it's a clue that we need to piece together this puzzle. Maybe it has something to do about what's about to take place at Sinai. Well, let's look at this a little bit further, shall we? The name Yitro, where we get the name of this portion from. In the Hebrew, it's Strong's number 3503, Yitro. And it's translated as meaning his abundance. And yet, when we begin to break down the roots, we find that there's a lot more to this name than just this meaning, his abundance. It comes from the root yether, which means remainder, excess, rest, excellence. But it can also mean remnant. This word can also be used to refer to a cord or a rope. So literally, his name can also be translated as his remnant. Now, this is important because how many of you realize that the idea of a remnant is seen throughout the scriptures, isn't it? He's constantly talking about, that's what he's looking for. He's looking for a remnant. In fact, we read later in the prophets, it's the remnant, this thing that we really don't know who they are or what they are, that it's the remnant that's gathered and returned, aren't they? In Jeremiah 23, verse 3, he says, "And I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries whither I have driven them, and will bring them again to their folds, and they shall be fruitful and increase." The remnant's important. The remnant's who he's looking for. The remnant's the one that's going to be gathered, that's going to return, that's going to be fruitful, that's once again going to be given access to this covenant. Well, we know today that it's a fact that we're part of the group that's been driven out, aren't we? We've been scattered. We know that. We're in all the nations. Yet the question remains, are we part of the remnant? We've been scattered, but are we going to be part of the group that's gathered? Are we going to be part of the group that returns? And in order to understand that, we need to understand, what is a remnant? Does it just mean that it's a little piece of the greater group? In other words, you better really behave because only a small section of you is getting back. Or is there a little bit more to it? Is he about to define the type of individuals that he's looking for? Is he about to define the ones that he's going to gather? And if so, don't we want to know what he's looking for? Wouldn't you like to be part of the group that can stand at the mountain again and hear the words? We find that the existence of a remnant brings about the idea that something can't be exterminated. Say hallelujah. No matter what comes against you, no matter what kind of battle, the idea of a remnant means that you're not going to be completely cut off. Some of you may feel like we're at that point exterminated, but Yahweh promises there's going to be a remnant. There's going to be an abundance. And we find that this is where this idea of a remnant comes from, that there is more than enough. How many realize that Yahweh is more than enough? No matter what situation you may be going through, he is much more than able. But I want to call your attention to the fact that there's this connection. When we look at this word remnant, this idea that there's more enough, something that can't be cut off, something that can't be extinguished and exterminated, that it's also connected to this idea of a rope or a cord. We understand that ropes and cords are used to tie things, right? They're used to hold things together. Well, when we look at this word for cord and the way it's used in the scriptures, it's specifically referring to the type of cords that would be used to tie down the tabernacle, to keep it stable, to hold it together. But the interesting thing is that this same term for these ropes, these cords, that when you see it in the scriptures, if the tent cords were destroyed, it was symbolic of one being destroyed by their enemies. And so now we find that when we begin to look at this idea of the remnant, the Yitro, that it has something to do with this idea of the rope or the cord. And when we begin to connect it, it begins to define what the remnant does. We find that the remnant, the one that Yahweh is intending on gathering, the one that he's intending on allowing to return, the one that he's looking for, that the idea of the remnant from the biblical perspective is not just the smaller section of the pie, a piece of the whole, but instead the idea of the remnant from a Hebrew perspective infers that it's the remnant, this group, this selection of individuals that holds the entire group together. In other words, it's the remnant that can bring unity to the whole house. It's the remnant, it's this group of individuals that their walk, their stand encourages the rest. How many of you want to be part of the remnant? Amen. We find that this is quite a different concept, isn't it? So often we think of the remnant, oh, it's that little group of individuals that's going to make it in by the skin of their teeth because the rest is going to be wiped out. And yet whenever he begins to speak of the remnant, he's referring to this group of individuals that's able to keep the house stable. Just like the ropes or the cords, they stabilize the tabernacle. Do you realize you're supposed to be the tabernacle? You're the house of Yahweh. His presence dwells in you. And he's referring to the individuals, the remnant that can keep it stable, keep the tabernacle together. We find that there's a lot of issues that can divide us. There's a lot of problems that can cause us to split, to break apart, to become weaker. But it's the remnant that says, no, we're going to hold fast. We're going to stay together. We're going to keep it going. We're going to keep the body moving. And we find that it's their stand, it's their commitment to be obedient that then can encourage the rest of the house. That's why the remnant is so important, especially in the end days. There's going to be a lot of things that would cause the house to become unstable, to cause it to be shaken, to cause it to be sifted, but it's the remnant that will remind it to stand, to hold fast. Could it be then that it's the remnant in the last days that's going to be in the tabernacle? Remember, this same word can refer to the cords, the ropes that are used to fasten, to build a proper dwelling place for Yahweh. It would seem then that to fail to be one that's attempting to be part of this remnant, to fail to be one that's actively trying to build his house, to make a proper dwelling place for him, then that puts us in the category of one that's allowing the tent cords to be broken. It puts us in the category of one that's allowing the house to be destroyed by our enemies. Because do you realize the enemy can't get in the house unless the strong man's bound? He can't get in the house unless he's got legal access. He's got to be allowed to get in. And we're being reminded that as Israel's preparing to go to Mount Sinai, as they're preparing to receive the covenant, the first thing that's happening is that they're being reminded of the need to keep the house secure, to keep the house unified, to keep their eyes on him. Because if the enemy's allowed in, then the house can be destroyed. It seems in that Israel's journey into the wilderness, it serves the purpose of revealing the remnant. We find that their wilderness journey, it's a time of testing, isn't it? It's a time of them being sifted. And we find that as this generation comes out of Egypt, Yahweh begins to inspect them, to sift them, to shake them. And he's revealing those among the group that are willing to build his house. He begins to reveal among the multitude those to become the tabernacle. And we find that it exposes those who would be willing to allow it to be destroyed. They would be instrumental in allowing its destruction. Well, let me ask you a question. What have we been involved in? We find that this same pattern is going to play out again. We find that once again, Yahweh's looking for a remnant. And as we're being sifted, we're all going through things. We all admitted earlier, we all need prayer. We're all being sifted. We're all going through things. Well, what's the sifting for? He's looking to see who's going to be a fit tabernacle, who's willing to be one that'll build his house. Well, let's continue to look at this name, Yitro. Because what are the identifying characteristics of one that's a fit tabernacle, of one that's willing to build his house? When we look at the name Yitro, we find that it's spelled Yod, Tav, Resh, Vav. The Yod as a prefix means he will or you will. It's connected to the Tav, Resh, which the root in Hebrew, it means to search out something, to explore it, to seek it out. We find that this is connected to the letter Vav, which represents the connector, the nail, the hook. The Vav becomes symbolic of the Messiah, who's your connector. He's the nail, the hook, the one that joins things together. He's the Vav man. And so when we begin to look at this idea of the remnant, this name Yitro, the name of this Torah portion, it seems to declare that in order to be part of the remnant, in order to be part of this group of individuals that he's gathering to build his house, that we must search out, we must explore, we must seek for the Vav man. We must search for the Messiah. And we find that this then becomes the test. How much effort will we put into searching for him? Earlier we sang the songs about how allowing him to come and be a flame upon our heart, a fire, that his love's unquenchable, and yet we find that the test becomes how unquenchable is ours in return. They're being brought into the wilderness, they're being shaken, they're being sifted, and he's beginning to, are they willing to allow him to, are they willing to allow themselves to make room for him on the inside? Are they willing to seek him, to search him out as the deer pants for the water? Are they hungry enough for him? Are they thirsty enough for him? If we look at the value of this name, Yitro, it equals 616. It just so happens it's the same as the phrase ha-Torah, the Torah. It seems as if then that the method in which the remnant is going to be sifted and revealed, the emphasis is being put on how much they're willing to search out this, how much they're willing to seek out the Messiah through the Torah. We find that it's the Torah, then it's his word that becomes the measuring rod. We find that when they're presented with this, when they begin to be exposed to his word, that it's his word that's going to test, it's going to sift, it's going to measure the strength of these cords. Are these cords strong enough? Are they able to stand? Are they going to keep the house together? Or are these weak cords that are easily broken? Are these cords that will be thrown about by the enemy? Got a backbone like a water hose, unable to stand, flipping any way, that really doesn't keep it stable. Well, we find that it's no accident then that it's on the heels of the arrival of Jethro that Israel is given the Torah at Sinai. It's interesting that when we look at the way this plays out, it seems as if the arrival of Jethro into the camp, his name becomes a prophetical declaration that when Israel is presented with the Torah, when they receive the words of Yahweh, they're being reminded before they ever get to the mountain what's going to happen. They're being reminded that as this word goes forth from the mountain, it's going to sift you. It's going to search you. It's going to shake you. And the purpose is because he's about to reveal what's on the heart, on the inside. He's about to reveal exactly what their intent is in this relationship with him. And we find that how they respond to the giving of the Torah, how they respond to Yahweh uttering these words is going to expose them either as fit to build his house, a vessel that's ready, a vessel that's capable of housing him among themselves, or if they're unfit to be part of the remnant. Well, do you realize that the same thing is happening today? Once again, his word is going forth. The Torah is being presented, and we find that once again, we're being reminded as well. How we handle this, what we do with it, how we respond to it is going to determine whether or not we're fit to build the house. It's going to determine whether or not we make the cut of those that would be seen as the remnant. And it's the remnant that's gathered. It's the remnant that's fruitful. It's the remnant that returns. So now we can begin to understand this purpose at Mount Sinai. They already had been exposed to the Torah. They knew the commandments. It's been passed down. They knew there was a covenant. But the purpose of Mount Sinai was a measuring rod. They're being measured to see exactly what are they going to do with it. They're being given an opportunity. What will you do with it? Well, let's look at how Israel responds at Mount Sinai. We understand they're forewarned. They know that this experience is something very special, something very important. It's going to be a measuring of themselves. When we find Yahweh beginning to do this at Mount Sinai, we're told in Exodus chapter 20, verse 18, that this is the way it begins to take place. It says, and all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they were moved and stood afar off. How many of you, whenever you've read this passage, it seems as if the mountain's on fire, it's loud, it's noisy, it's smoking, and they just got scared. Poor Israelites. They just got scared, so they removed themselves, no harm done. Moses went up and talked to them, and everything's still good, is the way it seems in the English. But when you begin to read this in the Hebrew, you'll find that the Aleph Tav is attached to all of these words. It specifically says that the Aleph Tav thunderings, they saw the Aleph Tav lightnings, they saw the Aleph Tav noise of the trumpet. In other words, they saw the Messiah on the mountain. They heard the voice of the Messiah on the mountain. They see him. They're being presented with the Vav man upon the mountain. Remember, the whole purpose is how are they going to respond to him? How are they going to handle him? Will they seek him? Will they run after him? They do. Well, let's look a little bit further and see exactly how they handle him, how they respond to him. We're told that they were moved and they stood afar off. But before we look at that, I want to look at this word for lightnings, because I believe you're going to see something that maybe you haven't seen before. It's very powerful, and it's very descriptive in the Hebrew language of what's taking place here. We're told that they saw the thunderings, which is the word kol. They saw the voice on the mountain, and they saw the lightnings. The word lightnings in Hebrew is lapid. It's Strong's number 3940, and it means a torch, a lamp. But it starts to get interesting, because when you look at this word lapid, it can refer to a torch that's cast aside, but made low and despised. And if you continue to look, you'll find the three-letter root of this word lapid, the torch, the lamp that they see upon the mountain. That root, the pei, yod, dalet, can form the word meaning ruin, destruction, disaster. And it comes from an unused root meaning to pierce. Lightning may be going off. Being told in the Hebrew language, it's not that the mountain, that there's a storm on top of the mountain. There's lightning and thunders, and they get scared, and they run away from the mountain. That's not what's taking place. In the Hebrew, it's very clear. They saw the Aleph and Tav on the mountain. They saw the Messiah on the mountain. And in the Hebrew, this word for lightnings begins to present the fact that Israel sees the image of a man. They see the man on the mountain, one that's been high esteemed. And we find that they're being warned that if they cast him aside, if they despise him, that then it's going to open the door to destruction. Now let's look a little bit further at this term, lapid. The first reference is in Genesis chapter 15, verse 17, where once again we see the torch, we see the lamp. Burning lamp, it passes between the pieces when Abraham's cutting the covenant with Yahweh. In modern times, this really doesn't make a lot of sense to us. We chalk it up, oh, it's sacrifices, and that's that, and he cut them in half, and it's kind of weird, and it's kind of this ritual that's going on, but we really don't understand the significance of what's taking place, because it has everything to do with what's taking place at Sinai. In ancient covenant cutting, it was a common practice to take animals, to sacrifice them, to cut them in half when they were breaking the covenant. And the purpose was that the individuals that were coming into covenant with one another would now walk between the pieces. And they understood that as they walked between the pieces, that if I break this covenant, if I don't value it, if I put no worth upon this covenant, then what happened to these animals that have been cut in half, that have been sacrificed, that's the punishment that's going to happen to me. That's the consequences of this covenant. That's how important it is. And we find that when we read this in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham doesn't walk between the pieces, does he? The burning lamp. It's the lapid that walks between the pieces. In other words, it's not Abraham that's going to pay the consequences when this covenant gets broke. It's this torch, it's the burning lamp that's now promising that if this covenant is broke, I'm the one that's walked between the pieces. I'll be the one that takes the consequences. The lamp, the Messiah. And now we fast forward to Israel at Mount Sinai. And we find once again the burning torch, the lamp, has appeared upon the mountain. The one that first cut the covenant is now here with the descendants of Abraham. And we find that when Israel is at the base of Mount Sinai, instead of coming to the Vavman, instead of coming to the lamp, we find that they instead choose to remove themselves instead of searching him out as they were supposed to. And we find that the torch, the lamp, the one that's cut this covenant with him, he now becomes a torch that's cast aside, a lamp that's despised, a man that was formerly highly esteemed, but now made low. And we find that because of their unfaithfulness, because of their unwillingness to enter into this with him, they actually open the door to destruction and calamity when they withdraw, when they remove themselves. The curse of the covenant and the consequences for breaking it now comes into play. And we find that the lamp, the lapid, the torch that chose to make this covenant, he now becomes the pierced one. In Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, we're told, but he was wounded, he was pierced for our transgressions. That word transgression is rebellion in the Hebrew. He becomes pierced when they rebel against the covenant. Let's look at this term afar off. Because in the English, it seems as if they just removed themselves because of the lightning and the thunder. They got scared, they got antsy, and so they removed themselves afar off from the mountain. Yet in the Hebrew, it's the word meaning remote, far or distant, but it comes from the root meaning to be or become far or distant, to be removed, but it can have the sense of to thrust something away from yourself, to be repelled by something. Can you begin to see now the seriousness of what's taking place at Sinai? It's not simply that the children of Israel removed themselves from the mountain, it's that they were repelled by the Vavman. They thrust him away from themselves. They were repelled by the lamp. They were repelled by the very one that brought them out and is now attempting to speak to them. You realize this was the climax of the Exodus journey. They're brought to Mount Sinai. They're brought to the moment of intimacy when we find that their husband is now about to pour his love upon them. He's about to speak his word into their lives. And they have been prepared up until this moment to be a vessel, to be a container. And they're repelled by him. My goodness. How many times have we done the same thing? How many times have we found ourselves in a situation where he comes and he begins to speak into our lives and we feel his presence and he attempts to move in our lives and he attempts to speak his words into our ears, but yet instead of listening, instead of allowing him this intimate encounter with us, we find that we remove ourselves. We're repelled, and instead of searching him out, instead of seeking it out, we thrust him away. And the one that was highly esteemed, the one that was the burning lamp, the one that made this covenant with us, dead, he now becomes despised and cast aside. The one that's made low. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 20, it says that, and Moshe said unto the people, fear not, for Elohim come to prove you, and that his spirit but you sin not. This is after they remove themselves. We find that this word prove in Hebrew, it's nasan. It means to test, to prove, to tempt. It's dealing with them being put to the test, being put to the proof. They're being reminded this is the purpose of this encounter. He's testing your hearts. He's proving you. He's attempting to see if you're at his house. This word nasa, to prove, to test, it's spelled with the same letters as sinah, a bush, a thorny bush. It describes the burning bush that Moshe saw previously at this same location. And it shares the same roots as Mount Sinai. They're being reminded, you're going through the same experience I did. You're seeing the lamp, the burning bush, the torch upon the mountain. But the interesting thing is this word sinah, it contains the same root, that samek nun, which means the learned man. Moshe is reminding the children of Israel that you're being tested on how you're going to handle the learned man. This is who is upon the mountain. It's the Messiah. And as the Torah is being given, it's him in written form. They're being reminded that whatever they do with this covenant that's being presented with him, it's as if they've just handled him that way. So when we neglect this, when we want nothing to do with this, when we put no emphasis on this, when it's the last of our priorities, we're being reminded it's as if we've just put him on the bottom of the list of our priorities. We've just mishandled him. We've made him low. We've cast him aside. We've despised the light. We find that Israel here at the mountain, they expose themselves as being unfit to build the house, being unwilling. Is it any wonder then that that entire generation is cut off, isn't it? We find from this moment forward, they now become a generation that's destined to be cut off and not allowed to enter into the land until another generation is raised up that would understand how precious it is to search him out, to seek him, to run after him. We find that you and I today are also being reminded there's going to be a remnant in the last days. And we all acknowledge that we want to be part of this remnant. And we find that we're being reminded that in order to be part of the remnant, it's going to hinge upon how we handle the Vav man, how we handle him, how we handle his word, how we allow ourselves to be a vessel that's fit to carry him. Do you realize that he's very specific on how his tabernacle was to be built? He wasn't going to allow himself to be housed in just any vessel. It had to be kadosh. It had to be set apart. It had to be holy. In other words, the remnant's being searched. The remnant's being sifted, and he's seeing which out of this group, this household that's been scattered, which of these individuals is willing to set themselves apart? Which one is willing to run after him, to seek him, to search him, to handle the Vav man in the way that he's meant to be handled? Well, it's interesting because we find that this isn't the first time Israel's being proven, tested, this word Nasa. Instead, when we backtrack, we find that there's 3 other occasions upon the Exodus journey where this word is being used. And there's one previous to that with Abraham. These are previous encounters where they're being tested, they're being proven. And we need to look at this because obviously it has something to do with whether or not we get to be part of the remnant. This testing, this proving has something to do with whether or not we get to enter into the land. Well, these 3 encounters, we see the first one in Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. And it's dealing with Abraham. It says, and it came to pass after these things that Elohim did tempt Nasa, Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. The next 2 have to deal with the children of Israel specifically before they get to Mount Sinai. They're proven, they're tested. Sinai's the last time. In Exodus 15, verse 25 through 26, we see the children of Israel, the first testing, the first proving. It's at the bitter waters of Manna. We find that when you go back and read these verses, that if Israel would hearken unto Yahweh and keep his commandments, then he promises to be Yahweh Rapha. He promises to be Yahweh their healer. And he makes the declaration that if you'll keep all of these mitzvot, but wait, I thought they weren't given yet. That's later. So obviously they knew something. If you'll keep all of these commandments, if you'll keep my word, if you'll shema to me, then I'm not going to put any of the diseases of Egypt upon you. I'll be Yahweh Rapha. I'll be Yahweh. That has to do with them being willing to take the stick and throw it in the water to make the water sweet. The next time we see Yahweh proving, testing the children of Israel is in Exodus chapter 16, verse 4. And it just so happens that it deals with the gathering of the manna. It says, then said Yahweh unto Moshe, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove, that I may nasa them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And by the way, that term law there is Torah. Did you realize that it's not just about keeping Shabbat? It's not just about keeping the feast and festivals, keeping kosher. All of that's part of it. But another part of keeping the Torah, the part that he's proving you on, is whether you're willing or not to gather the manna. The manna being symbolic of his word, the Torah. He's proving you to see what you're willing to gather, what you're willing to put in, whether you're going to walk or not. Well, we're going to look at each of these instances a little closer because each of these is playing into Israel's response at Sinai. Each of these is leading them up, preparing them for how they're going to respond to him when they see him upon the mountain. First, let's look at Abraham's response. It's the same response that Moshe gives when he's called by Yahweh from the burning bush. When Yahweh shows up to test, to prove, to Nasa Abraham, his here I am. In Hebrew, it's Hanani. It just so happens that it has a numerical value or gematria of 115. It's the same as that word, Nasa, to prove, to test. And it's the same value as the word Sina, the burning bush. It seems in the connection that the proper response when Yahweh comes to Nasai you, to test you, to prove you, what's the proper response? Here I am. In the English, though, I'm here just seems as if you're present. I'm here, I am. But in the Hebrew, this term Hanani, it carries a lot more weight than that. When you begin to study there, I stand. In other words, it's a bottom line that's being drawn. Line being drawn, I stand. Here I'm going to make my stand. No matter what happens, no matter what storms or problems or troubles may come my way, even though I know this is going to most likely happen, this is where I make my stand. Here I am, Hanani. Amen? We find that it comes from the root Hane in Hebrew, which means to behold, to see. It's used for pointing out persons, things, or places, as well as actions. In other words, to respond with Hanani, it's pointing you out. You don't have to wait for him to decide he's going to test you. You can say, Hanani, I'm ready. Test me, prove me, sift me, shake me. It's a reply of ready obedience. So to respond to Hanani, it shows that we're readily obedient to whatever task he may give us. You realize it's easy to say Hanani. It's easy to say this if we don't fully understand it. It's easy to say I'm here and I'm going to follow when it's the popular thing to do. It's easy to say, yep, we're going to stand. There's no struggle. There's no battle. It's easy to make the stand. It's easy to say that we're going to follow him and do what he says. As long as it's proud, it's easy to say where we stand. Find that that's not. Hanani comes into play when things get tough. Hanani, meaning to stand, to be here, comes into play when people begin to think that you're crazy. When Yahweh tells you to do something and it just don't make sense and everyone else thinks that you've lost your mind. When everyone else, you start to lose friends. When the going gets tough. When all of a sudden things aren't easy. All kinds of things are happening now once you make this declaration. When the enemy launches an assault against you, when the problems begin to happen, it's not so easy anymore. That's when Hanani comes in. That's when we declare, I'm going to make my stand. I know it's not easy. I know it's not popular, but guess what? This is where I stand, and I'm going to follow Yahweh. I'm going to be obedient. We find that this is the declaration of the remnant. It's interesting because we see this same term in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8. It's probably one of the most famous usages of Hanani. It's one we like to quote quite often. It's speaking of Isaiah. It says, also I heard the voice of Adonai saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, here am I, Hanani, send me. How many of you are willing to make that declaration when Yahweh sends forth the call? Who will go for us? Let's look at this word send, because it's going to define what he's asking you to do. The word send is Strong's number 7971 in Hebrew, shalach. And it means to send away, to let go, or to stretch out. We're going to break this word down in the Hebrew. It's spelled Shin Lamed Ket. That Shin Lamed root forms the word Saul. It's the root in Hebrew, and it means a grievous sin, one that's worthy of death. We find that it's used only once, and it's in reference to Uzzah in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 7. His grievous sin that he was guilty of was that he mishandled the ark. He mishandled the Vav man. He mishandled the presence of Yahweh, and he struck down a sin that's worthy of death. We find that this root is connected to the letter ket here in this word for sin. The ket represents a fence, a barrier, but it can mean a place of protection, a place of intimacy. And so when we see this statement being made, who will go for us? Whom shall I send? The quest that was at hand, the job that's being looked for someone to fill, the question is, who's going to go to be the ark? Who's going to be the one that'll be the place of protection, the place of intimacy? So we find that the testing, the sifting that's taking place is he's attempting to determine out of this group of individuals that's gathered at the base of Mount Sinai, out of this group of individuals that's coming out from the nations, that's coming and saying they want to be obedient, who out of this group is willing to be the ark? Who out of this group is willing to handle him correctly? We find that the sifting, the testing will begin to separate those who will mishandle his presence from those that will be a place of sanctuary for it. We find that this is what the testing is about in the wilderness. This was the goal of Sinai, testing to see who out of the group of individuals that's gathered at the mountain, who will be the ark, who's willing to house his presence. And we find that this is the test of the remnant in the last days. Who's willing to be the ark? Who's willing to handle his presence correctly? Well, if we're to function as the ark, if the remnant's responsible for building the tabernacle, for being a place where his presence can dwell, for being vessels that can be filled by him, then we need to remember what was in the ark. The ark's a container. You're a container. You're a vessel. What's in you will determine whether or not you can be qualified as an ark. In the ark, we find there was the rod of Aaron, the tablets of stone, and the pot of manna. Well, remember earlier we spoke about this term nisah, the proving, the testing of Israel. 3 times we find Israel in the wilderness being tested and proven up into this point. The first time was the bitter waters of Marah. Could it be that it's correlating to the rod of Aaron? The second time is the gathering of the manna. They're being tested. Well, look at that. In the ark's the pot of manna. The third time they're tested, they're proven, their nisah is at Mount Sinai, where they're given the tablets of stone, also in the ark. We find that each time, each method of testing was dealing with a specific area of something that was supposed to be inside of them. If they're the ark, they're going to have these articles. They're going to have the rod. It's dealing with the authority of Yahweh in their life. They're going to have the manna, his word. They're going to have the tablets of stone, the covenant written upon their hearts. So we find that each time Yahweh was testing the children of Israel, it was dealing specifically with an aspect of how they were to function as the ark of his presence, of how they were to function as a vessel that would house him. We find that we're supposed to be the ark. Yet whether we're fulfilling this role or not depends upon how we respond in the testing process. We're given opportunities to gather the manna. We're given opportunities to exercise his authority in our lives. We're given opportunities to allow his covenant, his Torah to be written upon our hearts. But whether or not we can function as the ark, it depends upon what we do with these opportunities. How do we handle the learned man? How do we handle his presence in our lives? Let's look at this word for ark. If we're to be the ark, what does that mean? The word ark in Hebrew is aron, and it means a chest, an ark. It's a container. In other words, it's inferring it needs to house something. It's what it's housing that makes it valuable. The vessel itself is not really of any worth until you see what's on the inside of it. It's what was inside of the ark that made it special. It was the fact that the presence of Yahweh was in this ark that made it unique and special. Well, we find then that if we're to be the ark, we've been made as a vessel. That means whatever's inside of us is going to come in. This is what's being sifted. This is what's being shaken. Well, let's look a little further. If you look at the value of this term, aron, ark, it has a numerical value of 257. Well, 257 is the same value as the word meribah. Meribah means strife, contention. And it's interesting because you'll find that it was at this location, at Meribah, the place of strife and contention, that we find that Israel, instead of Yahweh testing Israel, Israel tests Yahweh. Exodus 17:7 says, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because the children of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted, they nisah, the same word, Yahweh, saying, is Yahweh among us or not? Could it be then that maybe this is hinting at the fact that we're a vessel, we're an ark, we house something, but it seems to be reminding us of the fact that we have a tendency, we have a pattern we had it to be an ark that houses strife, that houses contention instead of his presence. And we find that he's reminding that when you're faced with these circumstances, when you're faced with these times where you're being tested and you're being proven and you're being shaken, how we respond determines whether we're an ark that's housing strife, division, mumbling, complaining, or if we're an ark that's housing his presence. We find here that Israel attempted to reverse the roles. They misunderstood what was at stake, and instead of allowing Yahweh to prove that they were willing and ready to be his ark, we find that they challenged him and they exposed themselves as arks of strife and division, a container that has this inside of it instead of his presence. When you read this, and this is directly before the Sinai encounter, we find that directly after the encounter at Massa and Meribah, when they exposed themselves as individuals full of strife, division, contention, ones that aren't keeping the tabernacle together, ones that weren't making the stand, we find that directly after this, it just so happens that Amalek shows up on the scene. Let's look at Amalek. Amalek is translated as meaning a dweller in a valley. Amalek seems to be so hated by Yahweh, so controversial, that Yahweh makes the statement that his name has to be blotted, completely done away with. Let's look at his name a little bit further. Dweller in a valley really doesn't quite define the characteristics of Amalek. When we look at the three-letter root, it's the ayin mem lamed. It's the word amal, which can mean to toil, to labor, to suffer. The overall usage of this word means to suffer. It stresses that whatever you're suffering, whatever you're going through, is that it's meaningless. The effort that's being put forth, there was no use for it. But this word can also be used to describe the labor of building the house of Yahweh. Amalek shows up on the scene, and Israel has to deal with them, it seems, because they looked at the building of the house of Yahweh as meaningless. They looked at the role of being the ark, being the one that would house his presence, as no use. They put no effort into it. And because of that, we find that Amalek turns up on the scene again. You realize that whenever the enemy shows up and you begin to deal with him, all of a sudden, we get real spiritual, don't we? All of a sudden, even though all the times in the past we may have been complaining, griping, had nothing to do with them, didn't have any time to be in the Word, when he shows up, all of a sudden we get super spiritual. All of a sudden we're calling out on the name of Yahweh, and we really expect him to show up. We really want, all of a sudden, now we want him in here. Now we want to make sure we're the ark, we're the vessel. Amalek is useful. Sometimes we need some Amalekites to tighten us up. Sometimes we can get lackadaisical, and yet Yahweh usually sends the one that's going to poke you, that's going to prod you, to make sure you remember you're supposed to be the ark. You're supposed to be housing his presence. Get the strife out, get the division out, get the complaining and the murmuring out. It's no accident that history repeats itself. This is not Israel's last encounter with Amalek. In fact, in the book of Esther, we read that it's a descendant of Amalek, Haman, that once again makes war against Israel. Isn't it funny that Haman almost destroys them because Israel saw the building of the house of Yahweh as unimportant? They weren't even supposed to be there. It was time to go home. It was time to build the temple. It was time to once again be a nation. It was time for the remnant to come back. But Israel was happy. It was fun in Persia. They had money. They had wealth. They had friends. They were popular. They didn't want to lose all of that. This was home. And yet we find that Amalek shows up again, reminding them, it's time for you to build the house. It's important that you build the house. Do you think that maybe Amalek will have a role again in these end days? Do you think that maybe we might need a reminder that it's time to build the house? That just maybe we can get lackadaisical as well, and we can get comfortable in the places that we've been scattered, and sometimes we need to be prodded. We need to be reminded, you best be building the house. It's time to be about the Father's business. It's time to make sure you're the ark, that his word is inside of you. Amen? With this in mind, let's take a look at the way Israel has a tendency to respond to these testings of Yahweh. Because we understand that this is here for our benefit. Not that we would ever act like this. Not that we would ever respond in this manner when he asks us to do something or he expects something of us. But let's just look at the way Israel had a tendency to respond. These are the characteristics that we don't want. We don't want to be guilty in these areas. In Exodus 15:24, at the bitter waters of Marah, the first time they're being tested, they're being proven, Nasa, to see, are they willing to be the ark? Will they handle him properly? Will they be set apart, kadosh unto him? Will they be a remnant? In Exodus 15:24, this is their response. And the people murmured against Moshe, saying, what shall we drink? Because the waters were bitter. Let's look at the word murmured. It's Strong's number 3885, loon, and it means to lodge, to stop over, to pass the night, to abide. It can also mean to grumble, to complain, to murmur. Notice how it can also infer that it's not just a passing, fleeting murmuring, complaining, grumbling, but it also means to lodge there, to stay the night, to just abide. Whenever you start complaining, do you realize we've got a tendency to just wallow us out a spot and we have a tendency to stay there? The complaining isn't just for a few moments. It seems to take over, and it's something that's constant. It becomes where we live. We're complainers. We're murmurers. We're grumblers. We complain, and we find that this becomes where we dwell. Here in this verse, it's conjugated as vayi lonu, and they murmured. It has a value of 102. Well, remember, what's the proper response when Yahweh comes to test us? Hineni. Hineni has a value of 115. The difference between these two responses, to be one that murmurs or to be one that responds, here I am, here I stand. 115 minus 102 leaves you with the number 13. The number 13 is the number that's associated with the bride. Did you realize that your response can make a difference of whether you're the Kala, the bride, or not? Our response when Yahweh begins to prove us, to test us, when you're presented with the learned man, the Messiah, the Torah, his word, how you respond to it then determines whether you're the Kala, whether you're the bride, whether we're fit to help build his house, to be a vessel for him or not. Let's look a little bit further. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 4, we find the second testing comes about. This time it's about the gathering of the manna. In verse 4, it says, then said Yahweh unto Moshe, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them, whether they will walk in my law or not. Notice that it says a certain rate every day. In other words, if I pick this up once a month, maybe once a week if we're lucky, is that really walking? Is that really coming to the test or not? He says every day. Let's look at what we're to do. We're to gather a certain rate. The word gather is lakat. It's Strong's number 3950, and it means to pick up, to gather, to glean something, to gather it up. But it can also infer to collect oneself, to be gathered or assembled. It deals with gathering and coming together and presenting oneself. The interesting thing is that these same letters that form this word for gather, lakat, when you rearrange them, they form the word katal, which can mean to slaughter, to kill something. But specifically, it infers death of a person by burning. Let's look a little further. They're to gather a certain rate. The word for certain rate in Hebrew is dabar, meaning speech, the word. In other words, when you see this statement being made in the Hebrew, they're being told that Israel's going to be proven, they're going to be tested on their willingness to assemble themselves, to gather themselves in order to glean the dabar. They're going to be gathered and they're going to be tested on their willingness to glean his word. And we find that when you glean his word, when you gather the dabar, it will cause this man to die. It will cause the flesh to be burnt. It will cause your heart to be circumcised. Remember, you're coming in contact with the lapid, with the burning torch, and it begins to burn up the dross on the inside. It begins to refine you, to cause you to be a fit vessel that's ready and able to build the tabernacle. We find it's the gathering of the manna that would reveal the remnant. It's the gathering of the manna that would cause them to deal with this fleshly man, to get him out the way so they could be a fit ark. They could be a fit vessel, one that's kadosh, holy, set apart, and ready. We find that this is the task that we're once again presented with as well, and it becomes the test again as well. Are we willing to gather ourselves, to allow our hearts to be circumcised, to cut off the fleshly man and make room for the debar? You realize it takes room to put this in? This is why so often we have a tendency to neglect it, because if I pick this up, that means I got to get rid of something else, doesn't it? I can't shove something in a vessel that's already full of a bunch of other stuff. Something's got to go to make room for this. Yet we find that Israel's response is in Numbers chapter 11, verse 6. This is how they felt about that. This is what they thought of having to make room for this manna. It says, "But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes." That's all there is. The word dried away is yabesh. This manna has caused us to be dried up, dried away. It means to dry up, to be withered. But the interesting thing is that the two-letter root is the beit sheen, and it means to be ashamed, to be put to shame. It's connected with the one who's been unfaithful, and therefore, because they were unfaithful, they've become shamed. We find that their negligence in gathering the manna, their despising of his word, put them to shame. It exposed them as being unfaithful. It exposed them as being one that had been put to shame. Yet these same letters, this term yabesh, it can also form the word yeshab, which means to sit, to dwell, to remain, to abide somewhere. When you look at this word yeshab, the word picture that's presented is you have the letter yod, which means he will, and the sheen beit means to return, to repent, to come back. In other words, it becomes the clue of how to be the remnant. Remember, the remnant's the one that returns, right? The remnant is the one that's left. The remnant is the one that's able to abide and survive. The way you do that is when you diligently gather the manna, is when you diligently put it in, because it then marks you as one that's the ark, because you've got the rod, you've got the manna, you've got the stone tablets. We find then that it's how we handle the learned man, the Messiah, and his word, his Torah, that then determines whether we're part of the remnant or not. To despise the manna, to despise the word, to despise the Torah, marks us as one that's unfaithful. And because of that, we become ashamed. We're unfit to build the house. But we're reminded that if we'll be obedient, then we can be one who returns. How many of you want to return? You don't want to be left where we've been scattered. You don't want to be left as the ones that got lost along the way and died in the wilderness. We actually want to make it back. Be one that returns. Be one that's fit to build his house. Be one that can say we're part of the remnant. And we find the way we do that, the way that you're supposed to make teshuvah, the way that we come back, is by diligently gathering the manna. By going through these tests, these times of proving, where we prove that we're willing to be the ark. We're one that wants to build the tabernacle, one that's willing to make the stand to hold it together, to be strong cords, not ones that are easily broken, not ones that flop whatever way the wind's blowing, not ones that only make the stand when it's popular. Or when so, ones that will stand, ones that will say Hanani and seek him out. As we get ready to close, I want to close with 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. It's become the earmark of our ministry. In fact, David said it before we got up here. This has become the statement behind what I believe Yahweh wants of his people in the last days. We're told to study to show thyself approved unto Yahweh, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed. Notice that. That's the way you're not dying off in the wilderness, by rightly dividing the word of forth. He's once again looking for a dwelling place, isn't he? He's looking for a group of individuals that he can call the remnant, the ones that will bear fruit, the ones that will return, that will make a stand and cause the house to stand. And we find that as we're being tested, as we're being proven, the proper response that he's looking Hanani. Here I am. Here I stand. Here I will not be moved. Can you say amen? Hopefully that made sense and you enjoyed today's teaching.